Okay, so we're going to take a look at one more CSS transform function. We started off by looking at translate, which allowed us to move elements, shift them across the page. Then we looked at scale, which allows us to increase the size or shrink down elements. Now we're going to wrap things up with rotate. And rotate allows us to rotate elements on the page. Those are not the only three, remember. There are a bunch of other transform functions. Feel free to explore them, play around with them. Some of them are kind of fun, but they're kind of niche things. These three that I've brought out, that I've highlighted, are probably the most common, at least in my opinion, are the most common. In rotations in particular, you might be asking yourself, when are you rotating things on a page? It doesn't seem like something that's that important. But a really common situation actually is when you have loading icons, when you have any sort of a progress that's circular. I'll give you an example here. Here's something that we'll be building in just a couple of videos. Very, very simple animated loader. Ignore the animation part. We're going to get to that in just a video or two, how we actually make things loop, how we get them to continuously run. But underlying that is a rotation using the exact same syntax that we're about to learn. So there's a couple of elements here that are forever rotating. So to do that, the syntax is very, very straightforward. It's transform, just like we've seen with a colon, and then the function, which is called rotate. And then rotate takes one item, one parameter, which is a number of degrees or an angle. So it doesn't have to be in degrees. At the end of this video, I'll show some of the other units, but frankly, I've never seen anyone use anything other than degrees, even though you can. So again, we pass in a number along with DEG for degrees. And if it's positive, the rotation will be clockwise. If it's a negative number, it will be counterclockwise. But rather than just talk about it while looking at this boring slide, let's go to CodePen. I have a very simple one set up, just like the last couple of videos. I'll make this a bit bigger. So I've got two paragraphs, both say hello. The only difference is that one of them is styled with, or one of them has a class transformed, which I've given a different background color. Otherwise, they're the same dimensions, 50 by 50. They have the same border, the same text color. So what we're going to do is play around with rotate on this transformed one down here. So let's go ahead and do transform. Rotate is the name of the function, and then pass in a number of degrees. Let's go with 45 degrees, DEG. And there we go. So you can see that it rotated clockwise, 45 degrees, this direction. And also you can gather that it's rotating around the center point. And that's because the transform origin by default is the middle. It's the center of the element. But before we go about changing the origin, let's try a couple of other numbers here. So let's do 90 degrees. You can see we get 90 degrees clockwise, essentially to the right from this center point. As basically think of a pin being stuck right here, and we're rotating around that. If we go up to 180, we get a mirror image. And we can also do things with negative numbers. So negative 20 degrees is going to be 20 degrees counterclockwise around that center origin. And we can also use decimals. So we could do, if you wanted to, you won't notice a change here, but 0.9, well, actually that is noticeable. You can see it's slightly skewed. Let me comment that out. There we go. You can see that very slight shift that's happening. So you can use decimals as well. The other thing worth mentioning is that you can use numbers greater than 360. So 360, of course, would be a complete rotation and we wouldn't see anything. But if you animate that when we get there, that actually is useful. If you rotate something a full 360 degrees and you tell it to take 1 second, you'll actually see the rotation happen. Right now it's instantaneous. But we can do things like 540 degrees. And you can see that it rotates. It's going around once and then continuing around a full 180 degrees. Okay, so that's the very basics of rotate on its own. Let's go back to something like 45 degrees. But now I'm going to talk about transform origin in conjunction with it. So again, the default origin is the center point here, but we can change that. So we could tell it to be the top left if we wanted it to, and it would essentially stick a pin in the top left and rotate around that, rather than rotating around the center. So we'll try that. Left, top. There you go. So this point remains where it was, just to prove that. Comment it out, and then we uncomment, and you can see it's rotating around that point. So you can also do things like rotate it around the right bottom if we wanted to. Now it's rotating around this point. And we can change that to be 90 degrees instead. There we go. With transform origin, we're not limited just to the keywords top, left, right, and bottom. We also have a whole bunch of other ways of using it. So we can provide specific pixel measurements or even centimeter measurements. We can provide things like inherit, initial, onset. Probably won't be doing that very much, but most commonly we're doing things like either giving it a pixel value or giving it top left or top right, or two of these keywords, these offset keywords. You can also do percentages as well. All right, so if you have any questions about transform origin, you can take a look at the docs here. They have a nice explanation with rotate. So here they're doing a 30-degree rotation and then changing the origin to a bunch of different values using things like EMs, using things like percentages, and then measurements 0 and 0. So before we wrap up, two other things I want to discuss. One is if we try and do two transforms, so let's also scale it down. So we're rotating it. We're going to do a transform, scale, and let's do by half, 0.5. Notice that it does scale down, but our rotate goes away. It was rotated 90 degrees to the right. What's happening is that it's actually being overwritten by this transform. It's kind of annoying that we have to do this. The way around it is to provide a single transform like this. Even though they look like they're on different lines, they're part of the single or the same transform declaration, the same property, and now we have both being applied. It's being rotated and it's being scaled. Okay, so that's the very basics of that. The other thing I want to touch on is when we talk about angles. So I said you don't have to use degrees, even though that's by far the most common. You could do things like gradients, radians, if you can remember back to trigonometry or I guess calculus if you took that. If not, don't worry about it. Nobody uses this for the most part in web development, but it is an option. And then this one, turn, I've seen maybe once or twice before. It allows you to specify basically quarter turns, a half turn, a full turn using the word turn rather than degrees. So for example, 360 degrees is equivalent to 1 turn, or 90 degrees is equal to 0.25 turns. So if that's something that interests you, you don't like working with degrees, you definitely can do that. So let me just show that briefly here. Get rid of our transform origin, also get rid of our scale. So we have 90 degrees right now. We could replace that. Instead of with degrees, we could do 0.25 turn. It's kind of bizarre, but it's an option. Okay, so that wraps it up, and that actually wraps up our section on transform on its own. Now what we're going to learn to do is take those transforms, those translations, the scaling, and the rotations, and combine them with animations. That sort of rhymes. We're going to take them together to build more complex things and to animate them, to make them happen over a period of time, triggered by certain interactions, by a hover or by a click or something. So that's coming up next.